G'day cobbers, welcome back to the bush. In this episode of Lockyards for Driving, we're going to maintain the rear wheel bearings on this 79 series. The same as anything from the 40 series right through to the 105 series, even the solid axle Hilux. So, let's get into it. Now we're at the back side of the caliper and we need to undo these two bolts here and here. So we'll get on with that. One down, one to go. Now with the two bolts removed, we'll head to the other side. Let's pull that caliper off. And just secure your caliper out the road. Now we can actually get the rotor off. Now you need to make sure your park brakes are undone, or handbrakes off, and you should be able to pull this one forward. And it might need a little convincing. That one's not too bad at all. And there we go, that's the worst part of a LandCruiser, the park brake. Nothing stops a LandCruiser, not even the park brake. Now we can get on with the hub. Next up, we've got these half dozen nuts running around the axle flange. Now with those removed, take off your washers. And now we have to deal with the cone washers. So don't be tempted to take a hammer to the outside of here to pop these cone washers. They rely on a taper, and if the taper's not concentric to the axle, they're not going to work as a locking mechanism. So all you do is get a brass drift and whack them on the end with your little mash hammer. That's one done. Only 5 to go. There we go, that's lucky last. Now you might need to whack it around the edge. Now you'll notice I'm using a brass hammer and I'm not whacking where the cones are. Just to loosen up that axle a little bit. Might need to grab a screwdriver. Screwdriver to gently persuade it out. There we go. Now we can withdraw the axle from the differential. Next up, we need to remove these two screws. Now, they tend to be made of butter, so you need to be careful. If your screwdriver doesn't fit well, there's a chance that you might strip them out, and that's not good at all, let me tell you. So what I'm using is an impact screwdriver. What you do is you preload them up and you whack them on the end with a hammer. And it provides decent engagement and the hammer starts pushing it around. Nice and simple. And no stripped screwdriver heads. So we need to remove this preload nut now. Now, this is what the factory tool looks like. You can use a couple of screwdrivers, jam them in the holes, and run a screwdriver through the edge and twist it that way. That's a pain, just get one of these. They engage into the preload nut, and then you can just back it off. With that undone, we can just simply screw it out. Okay, we've got our preload nut out. Should be able to take off this hub now. Beautiful. Now time for the hub disassembly. So now with the hub out, we can remove the thrust washer, the outer bearing. Now to get the inner bearing out, the easiest way to do that, put it on a bit of an angle, put a brass drift in there, because you remember, we've got this seal to punch out as well. So put it on a bit of an angle, and just give it a whack with a hammer. As you can see, that's not only driven out the bearing, which we're going to replace anyway, so we don't care if we bugger it up, but the seal as well. Okay, so now we need to do a good clean up before we can remove the racers. Now, through the magic of editing, this is miraculously being reasonably well cleaned up. If you can see in here, we have 2 half moon cutouts, and that's where we place the end of our drift so we can knock out these races. So we've got one race here for the inner and the other race on the other side for the outer. So we'll grab our heavy hammer and give it a couple of whacks. That's one. Now we'll flip it over. And again, look for those 2 half moons. They're buried right down there. And we'll whack this side out. We're just about there. Of course, that's now gone flush. Close. There we go. There's our second race out. Rightio. Now we need to clean it up properly and get right into those edges, clean it all out. Okay, now giving it a good clean up. And what you want to make sure is you get right into the edges there, usually a piece of rag, and shove it right into the edge and make sure that's 100% clean, otherwise your bearing races aren't going to see properly. Now I'm using a bearing race insertion tool which works really well. You can, however, just drive it in with a brass drift, but be mindful of which way the taper goes. So because the bearing is coming in from this direction, the thinner part goes towards the top. If you do happen to put it in this way and drive it down, you're going to have a bear of a time trying to get it out. So make sure you put them in the right way. We just put the insertion tool in, and that fits nicely into the taper, and we drive it home. And you would have heard the pitch change then. That means it's all the way to the bottom. And you can check from the back side and make sure the gap down there, you get the screwdriver there, the gap down there is non-existent because it's nice and settled. Okay, so now we'll put the other side on. And again, I've already cleaned out this edge here, nice and clean, so our bearing race seats properly. Put that in, run it home. Again, we listen for that pitch change and we check in from the other side. Right down there, and that's seated nicely. Right, now we need to grease up the hub. So there's a bit of a reservoir in here for grease. So we just want to fill that up till it's nice and flat with the 2 bearing races. Right around the edge. And this is Penrite high temp bearing grease. Good grease. Not sponsored or anything, which I was, but that's what I use. And I've been using for many years. Okay, so now for your bearing. Get a big heap of grease, slap it in your hand. We'll do the inner first. So grab your bearing, and you need to force it from the back through to the front. And you'll be able to see in a moment, starting to come up. And there we are there. You can see it's starting to hydraulic its way through from one side, from the back side through to the top side. You need to do that right the way around. Okay, that's the last of our rear bearing. So we can pop it in there, but before we put that front bearing in, we'll put the seal in. I'll show you how to do that now. So let's put in the seal. So this is the old seal that came out. This is a different style of seal. This is the standard style of seal. So the outside here stays stationary against here, and the inside actually turns against the inner part of the spindle. This new style seal, this one's from Terrain Tamer, both the inner and the outer can spin independently of each other, which is a great design, especially if the spindle is worn from this style of seal on the back end of your car and they're not replaceable. So these ones, all we do, now I've cleaned out in and around here, put a bit of this blue gasket seal around the outside. That's all done. And if you have a look closely, here it says bearing side. So obviously that goes to the side of the bearings and we can push it in. Sometimes I'll pop out a little bit. Now if you are using, that's fine now, so we'll just wipe off the excess. If you are using the original style seal, best way I find of pushing these in is to use the old outer, and you can push that on the top and then you can push it down, so nice and evenly using a brass drift. But we've got the new style seal in there. Bob's your uncle. Spin him upside down, put a bit more grease in there, and we can drop that outer bearing in. Our hub's assembled now, ready to go back onto the car. Let's go and have a look at the spindle on the car. So I've cleaned up the outside here, and what we'll do is we'll pull out that inner axle seal. This is a seal puller tool. Can do it with a screwdriver, but I've got one, so why not use it? Give that a good clean out. You can use a bit of metho or whatever you got in there, isopropyl. If you're really pedantic, grab your new seal. And what we'll do is we'll put a little bit of blue around the outside. We'll try not to get it in the spring there. Once we've gone right around the edge, we can just pop that in. And we'll tend to want to skew sideways, so a little bit of perseverance. And there we go. Just wipe off the excess. Okay, now we can put the hub assembly back on. So ordinarily, you'd grease just a little bit up the back here with that seal, but because we're using those different style seals, the ones that can spin independently inner and outer, we're going to put a little bit of blue there, but we're not going to put any grease there. So we just grease the rest of the spindle, just a light coating, primarily to keep corrosion away, and we'll leave that inner section nice and dry. While we're at it, don't forget this is a spinning surface here, so we'll put a bit of grease on there as well. Now with that done, we can put the hub on. So we spin the hub over, this seal's actually dry. I'll get a little bit of the blue and I'll put that, just a gentle coating right around the edge there. And again, that's only because we're using that special style of seal, which apparently comes standard in the Train Tamer kit now, which is great. So I initially paid through the nose and was happy to, because they're so much better than your standard seal. Okay, with that done, let's put the hub back on. I have to watch that front bearing. It might need a little bit of a wiggle. There we go. Move that grease to the inside there. Now we've got the bearing preload nut. Now this needs just a gentle cover of grease over there. I've already cleaned this one up. And it indexes for the top there. Now for the preload nut. Okay, so this is the bearing preload nut. And this simply just spins on here. I've already covered it with a very slight layer of grease. You need to make sure it goes in nice and square. If it's not going in properly, find out why. Now we've got this handy dandy 3-prong tool here again. Now that's not going in straight or something, so I'll take him out and find out why. Okay, so we found the issue, and it simply was that the inner bearing seal hasn't seated properly. So I gave a bit of a push onto the hub and it's sealed now. So that's locked up all the way. Now what we need to do now is we need to make sure that that is 100% seated, because this car is going to see off-road corrugations, Canning stock route, Unadata track, probably the Amberdell. The way we do that is with a BFH. So what we do, don't let your mechanics friends watch this. Give it a spin. You want to give it a whack, give it a tighten. We got a little bit more out of that, so we'll keep going. You got to whack it like it owes you money. Tiny bit more. Let's keep going. There goes the head to the hammer. I might grab another hammer. So we've reinserted the handle into the hammer. We'll give it another crack, shall we? See if it comes off this time. Now I've still got a tiny bit more. Give it one more go. See if we can launch this hammerhead into the stratosphere again. Perhaps a low Earth orbit. Geostationary perhaps. Okay, I'm pretty sure that's settled now. So what we do is we back it off. Then we tension it up. Now there is a tension spec, and I think it's about a grunt and a half. That was maybe 2 grunts. Okay, now if we look on the end, and this is a trick for young players, you'll notice, if we zoom in a bit, 4 in the end of the spindle, 4 little notches. And what you need to do is you need to line up one of the lines here, one of these 3 lines here, with one of these notches here. Now, that one's pretty much dead nuts on, which is unusual. And when it's lined up there, then you can actually get the screws in, which we'll show you in a sec. Okay, so now we've got this line here lined up with this notch here in the end of the spindle. What you need to do is get yourself a bit of wire or something, as long as it's a smaller diameter than the shank of the screw, and poke around till you find out which one's lined up. I think it's that one there. That one's definitely shorter than that one there. So it'll be that one there and dead opposite. Now you'll notice these screws aren't normal screws, they've actually had a taper on the end. And that's to help with the alignment. We'll just run him in. And it should seat fully. If it's not seating fully, and it's got some tension there, have a look at your alignment. Okay, now you don't want to reef on these like a 100-pound gorilla, 200-pound gorilla, sorry, just so they're nice and seated. That one's good. And that one's seated too. Okay, so now it's time for the axle. So I put a new gasket on there, and as you can see, I put blue on both sides. Well, you can't see the reverse side, but there is blue there. The reason I've done that is this thing is a genuine off-road car and it's going to see water. and it's going to need lots of water. So, blue it is. Now we just insert the axle. Now I've cleaned up all the surfaces, put a bit more grease on there, and I might actually slip a bit more grease on that inner axle seal where that rides there. And when you put it in, you need to be mindful of where the dowels go, where the dowels are located. And you might need to spin the whole assembly a little bit just to push it into the differential in the centre. And actually, that one actually dropped in reasonably easily, which is good. I'll take a win. Doesn't matter which way it comes at me. So next one are all these cone washers, lovely cone washers. Then the flat washers. And then finally the nuts. And make sure they go on nice and smoothly. When we're doing the other side, one of them got a bit stuck. That's because the thread was a bit burred up. Actually had to get out the tap and die set and run it over. All those started by hand. Moving on properly. Oop, missed one. There we go. Now they're all started, we'll run them in. Rightio, now for the final tension, you can use a torque wrench, but I'm not here because I've done it once or twice. How much torque? Oh, about 1 grunt. And of course we do opposites. And once you think you've done opposites, go around it clockwise. And that way you're 100% sure that you've gotten every single one. Beautiful, done. So next up, we'll put the rotor back on. Of course, our park brake's off. Lined it up with our studs. And finally, the caliper goes back on. We just slide him over the top. And we've got 2 bolts to run in from the back. Final bolt on the caliper. And that one needs to be a solid 2 grunts. So that's it, guys. It's all rebuilt. So if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. And if you didn't, by all means, give it a thumbs down. Not once, not thrice, but twice. Thanks, guys. We'll see you in the next one. So if you've enjoyed this content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring that bell icon. It's really important to us and you won't miss out on our future content. Now, if you want to support the channel, by all means, consider becoming a patron on Patreon and you get things like early access to our videos on YouTube. Either way, we hope to see you out on the tracks.